Groovy. All right. Well, hopefully everybody enjoyed lunch and again got gassed up and ready to go because we've got a handful more of presentations to get through this afternoon. The first of which is going to be a really exciting deep dive. So we actually have an hour-long session planned here today with a team from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So here we have Dr. Matt Ritter and Dr. Jenn Yost, who are both professors at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, as well as then Dr. Natalie Love, who is a Frost postdoctoral fellow, as well as Camille Pawlak, who is a grad student. And they are here to give us, again, a very special deep dive into a lot of the work that they've been doing with the Urban Forest Ecosystem Institute to catalog and understand California's urban forests. So they're going to be providing an overview of the data sources that are currently available, and then letting us know how it is that we can access and use those tools. So it's going to be a really good deep dive session, and with that, I will pass it over to the team to talk more about that.
A standing ovation, and I haven't even said anything yet. What? I love the culture here. This is wonderful. Well, thank you all, and Kat, thanks for the introduction there. And my name is Matt Ritter, and I'm a professor in the biology department at Cal Poly, and we have what we're going to do is something a little different here. I'm going to just give an introduction, and then people from the team here are going to give a short 10 to 15 minute, 10 minute thing. And then we'll do a lot of back and forth, and hopefully we create some questions in your head that we can answer. And we have been creating tools for people to manage the urban forest. And I'll point out immediately, you see those logos at the bottom there. UFEI is our logo, Cal Poly is our university, and there's the CAL FIRE logo over there. And you have all met Walter Passmore. Walter, everybody right there? You guys, Walter and I have been working for several years together. He has awesome vision about what should be happening in the urban forest. And in many ways, we are a tool for Walter to do what he does and for you all to do what you do. And we create tools that are for you to better manage species and know what is being grown and what you're growing and what you're selecting and so on. And so you go to our website, you'll get all this information. And I'll start right there with ufei.calpoly.edu. And this is what our landing page looks like for that. And each one of those is a tab that brings you down into a sub-tool that you can use. And the one that I've circled there on the left is called Select Tree. And if you Google tree selection, you'll come up with Select Tree immediately. Hopefully, and I'm looking around, I'm trying to read faces. You guys have heard of Select Tree before? Okay. If you haven't, please check it out. And what it is it's an online interactive tool, and I'll show you a little bit about it here in a second. It's an online interactive tool for you to be able to get the right tree for the right place, the right tree species for the right place. And we are nearing 2,000 tree species on it with about 75 characters for all those trees and somewhere around 10,000 photos of those. So we're constantly collecting photos of mature trees and every parts of it and so on. And so Select Trees, if you click through that, it looks like this. It's an encyclopedia in the sense that you can start to type in a tree that is on a list that you're interested in, or say you're creating a list, a planting list or something like that. You start to type in the name you know. It actually is sort of irrelevant what the right name is, the name that you know, and you will find that tree. We, as many of you know, names of trees changes, or you've learned the scientific name of something and you realize it's something else, and there's taxonomists working in the background to create work for all of us. What we've done is usurp that whole thing by just making a really accessible database where you can type in red oak if you want, or you can type in red and you can just go click down and find the thing immediately, and you might not know that's Quercus rubra or it used to be something else. That's irrelevant. So the right at the top, that search bar that you see there should be very useful for you. And then just below that, which is search by characteristics, looks like this on the left. And so the page on the left there has all kinds of things that you can put in drop-down menus, and you can write things in. Say you want a California native tree that doesn't get taller than 25 feet that has red flowers. I got to go louder. Sorry. Cindy, I appreciate that. Thank you. Start yelling at you guys. So say you're interested in that. 3 characters. A tree that was less than 25 feet tall, makes red flowers, and is California native. And you click those 3 things and it'll query that database, 2,000 species, and return to you the trees that satisfy those characters. So it's incredibly useful for those types of things. An evergreen tree that gets to be really tall, or a deciduous tree that is a great shade park tree and is good for planting in things that are wider than 10 feet, that kind of thing. So all those characters are there. They're all searchable, and the search by characteristics will spit this type of thing out on the right, which is a tree page. It gives you the names, it gives you a bunch of photos. You can click through the photos, you can see the characters, you can do all of that. And it's a living document in the sense that if you see errors with it, you let us know immediately. We correct those, and we are curating it constantly. And that's part of the major work we do, is to create an encyclopedia for people who work in the urban forests in California. All California native trees are there. Almost all of the trees that are grown in the urban forest throughout the world are there, and so it gives a lot of selection possibility for people in California. Another interesting thing that I just have a really awesome feature that we just created that I think is fun. Do you guys know? Have you heard of the California Big Tree Registry? You want to get re-stoked on trees, you should go to this thing, and because what this is a list of the largest individual tree of a bunch of species that grow in California, the champion, they call it. And people go around California looking for the largest individual. We have 95 native species in California, and so people look for the largest individual of each of those 95 native species of trees that are in California. But we also put on cultivated things here. And what we've done just recently is created a map. And so you can zoom in and out on the map for the places you're interested in. Everything in green there has an exact coordinate, so you can go to the actual tree if you're driving by and you want to see what does the biggest valley oak look like. And the things in red there are people who don't want their tree publicly available, but we put it in the area, so you know we have a champion for that. That's a cool feature that we're really interested in, and there are a bunch of others on here. And what I want to do is allow my colleagues to go through and tell you about these individual things, and then we'll get back together and we'll start to answer and ask some questions of each other here when they're done with their presentation. So I'll pass it off to my colleague, Dr. Jenn Yost.
You guys might be standing up a lot in the next hour then. Okay, well, one of these tools on the UFI website is the culmination of a several year-long project that we've been working on, which is to understand what trees are in California. And so this is the California Urban Forest Inventory. And then I'll talk about a second tool that we've developed, which is the Urban Tree Detector. So cities fund inventories, and a city will have their inventory of their trees, but that inventory is usually not connected to the city next door or cities throughout California. And many of you come from the nonprofit sector, so you're planting trees, and then maybe your city inventory captures some of those trees, or maybe those trees are new. Anyway, we really don't have a great idea of what is actually being grown in California. And so what we've done over the last several years is collect tree inventories from every source that we can possibly get. So some of those sources involve publicly available tree inventory data. Some cities publish that data on a public-facing website. Most of these inventories were actually were funded by CAL FIRE funding to various urban forest programs at cities, and that data is all publicly available. Many private sector tree companies, they receive the funding from the city, and it's publicly available data. And though we have formed a collaboration with those private companies where they agree to share their data out of their databases back with us. And so WCA, A+, Davy, Planet Geo, and many others have contributed data to this resource. Now you can imagine that every tree inventory is different, and so we have a whole bunch of scripts that take all the crazy names that people put in their tree inventories and standardize them into one correct name, and we get rid of things like stumps and empty tree wells and all these other fields that show up in an inventory database. And then we present all of that data publicly on this website. And so this is a new resource that you all have access to just by going to that UFI website. This is the California Urban Forest Inventory, and it represents the largest data set for California trees. So 7 million trees now that have been inventoried, with over 500 species represented in this inventory. And, oh yeah, here's that data right there. Okay, so the way that it works is that you can filter the inventory for whatever you care about. So you can search by your county, you can filter it by your climate zone. If you care about attributes of the individual trees, like the family of tree or the species of tree, you can filter and see everywhere in California that occurs. But most people interact with this by filtering in the place column. So you can actually go to that place dropdown and select your city, and then you can see all of the individual inventoried points for your city. And I should also mention that it's aggregated at the zip code level. So part of our data agreement with these private companies is to not show precise points, and so we aggregate at the zip code level. So if you do that for the city of Sacramento, this is what it looks like. You zoom in on Sacramento, there's a circle for each zip code that we have inventory data for. We've got about 120,000 trees inventoried here and 269 species. And then below that map, it gives you a bunch of data about the city that you've filtered on. And so, for example, the chart tells you your most abundant tree species for your city. Platanus hispanica is 12% of Sacramento's urban forest, followed by Lagostromia at about 5.3%. So, and that chart is downloadable for any of your cities. And so you can just click that little button, and if you're trying to make the case of what do you have in your urban forest, there it is. And then we've linked this resource with SelectTree. So Matt just told you that SelectTree is this database of trees and their characters. And so then we present, based on the inventory that we know for Sacramento, here is the diameter of the trees in Sacramento, the water use rating for trees in Sacramento, the type, the foliage type, evergreen or deciduous, and also where those trees are from, and many other pie charts are found on this. So it gives you a sort of big picture of what's going on in your city as far as we know from inventoried points. You can also filter it by species. So let's say you were interested in where the Mexican sycamore grows, you could filter it by the Mexican sycamore, and you'd say, oh, there's 2,400 Mexican sycamores represented in inventories, and guess what? They mostly occur south of Point Conception. And so maybe you're not going to plant that tree in Sacramento, or maybe you're going to try it in Sacramento to see if it does well. So that's the California Urban Forest Inventory. Now, we are scientists. We want to know about all the trees. And so we've often been frustrated because the inventories represent only public trees on streets that get inventoried. And we want to know, like, what about all those backyard trees and everything that's not in the inventory? And so for the last several years, we've been working on a different project, which is to just use aerial imagery to detect all the trees in California so that we know the denominator of how many trees there actually are in our urban forest. And so here's an example of some aerial imagery, and the blue points there are inventoried data points. So, you know, you get like 10 trees along the street, but you go right into that parking lot and you have a whole lot more trees. And so those pink points are actually what our tree detector is able to pick up. This is what it looks like for the city of Santa Monica. The blue points are the inventoried points that we have for Santa Monica, and then the red points represent all the other trees that are in Santa Monica. And it's been a standing question, like how much of any given urban forest is public trees? How much is private? And we didn't really know that number for a long time. Now we actually know that number. And so what we've done is we've used NAPE imagery from 2020, and then we've selected a whole bunch of images, little tiles, and then a bunch of students from Cal Poly hand annotate each of those tiles. So thousands and thousands of these tiles to teach the computer, this is a tree, like the humans say, this is a tree, this is a tree, this is a tree. And then some computer magic happens and they say, okay, here's all the trees in California. And then we clipped that to the urban boundary because we're interested in urban trees. And that produces what we show on the website, which is tree counts for all of California. There's some problems with it, and we're still working on making it better. So some of the areas in which it doesn't do so well right now are in densely forested areas. Like if you have a dense riparian corridor going through your city, it's hard to detect individual trees in a dense clumpy canopy. And then you can see in San Francisco, if you have high-rise buildings there, the shadows in the imagery make it very hard to detect trees. It's even hard for a human to detect those trees. But it has provided a lot of data in places where we didn't have any data. So I'll use Bakersfield as an example. There is no city inventory for trees in Bakersfield, and many cities find themselves in this predicament where they say, I want to apply for funding to do an inventory, but I don't even know how many trees I need to be budgeting for. And so, for example, in Bakersfield, we detected 340,000 trees in Bakersfield, and you can see the two images there with the pink points as the computer detected points. So we've run this over now all the urban areas for California, and we can produce tree density maps. So where are there the most trees and where are there the least density of trees, and that's all found in the website. So we, for the first time, then could say things like, okay, well, how many trees per area? Like, what is the actual density of trees in our cities? And so this histogram here is looking at the 50 most populous cities in California. And what we found is that on average, there are about 2,000 trees per kilometer squared. Now, maybe that number might be kind of meaningless, but a lot of people think about trees in terms of trees per capita. And so for the 50 most populated cities in California, it's about 0.8 trees per capita. And that is a cool number because then you can do some goal setting with that. Like maybe in California, we want there to be at least 1 tree per person. That seems like a good goal. And then what we've been doing is trying to figure out how many of those trees that are detected are within sort of the public space versus the private space. And so we've been drawing street polygons and sort of a easement buffer along those streets. And so this is a new graph that we're playing around with. And so each row is a city. So Anaheim is on top, Bakersfield is the second one. They're in alphabetical order there. And the yellow portion of the bar are the trees on private property. And then the green portion of the bar are public streets. And it's broken down into street trees and park trees. And so what we find is that on average, about 20% of the urban forest is public trees, leaving 80% as private trees. And so that helps us think about sort of if we're dealing with management and we care about the whole picture of the urban forest, the cities tend to bear the biggest burden for these trees, but that's really only 20% on average of our urban forest. And so there's a whole nother, private section that needs to be addressed. Okay, so those are 2 tools that I hope that you use and I hope that you find beneficial in your work. And I'm gonna hand it over to Camille to talk about one way that we've used these data to figure out more things about the urban forest. Camille.
Wow. Thank you, Jen. That's great. So my name is Camille Pawlak, and I'm a graduate student with this team. And I want to talk to you today about California's native trees, and particularly the native trees in our urban environments throughout the state. And so over the past year, some of the work we've done on this topic is we've made digital range maps for each of California's 95 native trees. We've created city-specific native species lists for every city in California. And then with the data from the California Urban Forest Inventory, we've assessed the proportion of California's urban forests that are native or non-native based on that specific city. Okay, so California is home to a diverse set of tree species, and they're native to a wide range of climates across the state, from our deserts to our inland valleys to our alpine environments. There are 95 species of trees, which represent some of the oldest and largest trees in the world. And here you can see a few of them. So our coast redwood, our coast live oak, and our Monterey cypress. And these are all trees native to the state, growing maybe in, maybe out of their native range in different urban environments throughout the state. And so the first goal of this project was to really understand where do these trees occur. And so we made digital range maps for each of the 95 native species to the state. And the way we did that was by taking expert opinion from different botanists, like, for example, Griffin and Critchfield, who have an amazing book called Distribution of Forest Trees in California, Kaufman's Conifers of the Pacific Slope, Little's Atlas of United States Trees, different research papers on individual species distributions, and point occurrences from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And we made 95 range maps that look like what you see here, one for each species. So this is our range map for sugar pine, for example. And then once we have each of those range maps, what we're able to do is stack them together. And when we stack them together, we can see really interesting spatial relationships, like where in the state are there the most native trees. And so when you look at this heat map, those warm areas are areas where there are higher numbers of native tree species that occur natively there. So in our coast ranges and our sierras, you can see that there are more native tree species than in somewhere like our inland valleys and our deserts. And on this map also, you'll notice some no data kind of gray areas. And those are actually areas that they don't have native trees. Trees didn't grow there. So once we have this map, what we are able to do is overlay urban boundaries on top of it. And so these gray slashed areas are our state's urban boundaries. And if you look at those urban boundaries, what you might notice is that they appear to be in blue areas on the map, or areas that had lower numbers of native trees. And this is a trend that we've observed throughout the state. So our major urban areas tend to have few numbers of native tree species. And once we have those urban areas, what we're able to do is take each urban area's boundary, take each of our native species maps, and overlay them to find where they overlap. And that's how we make those city-specific native species lists. So for every city in California, we know exactly which species are native within that city's boundaries. And then once we've done that, taking those lists, you can count, right? Okay, how many species are native to, say, Sacramento? Well, the answer to that is 11. And so you can do that for every city in California, and we plot that here. So on the x-axis here is the number of native species to a city, and on the y-axis is the number of cities for which that is true. And so on average, California cities only have 7 native species. And many of you work in California's urban forests, probably all of you, and so you've walked around and you've seen the species diversity that's present, and you know that there are hundreds of species growing in California's urban forests. And so to only have 7 that are native on average, that's not a ton of species to choose from if you're looking to plant native species. And in fact, rarely are there more than 10 species of trees that are native to any city in California. But let's take a look at one city. So Los Angeles is a major urban area in California, and it actually has a really high number of native species compared to other cities in the state. There are 15 native tree species across the city boundary of Los Angeles. Some of those are some you might know and love, like the California bay laurel, the western sycamore, the coast live oak, or the white alder. And if we take a look at sort of the general LA metropolitan area, you'll see that in general, those urban areas are just like we saw in the trend across the state. The urban areas, the Los Angeles basin, are kind of low species diversity areas in terms of native trees. They're occurring on those blue areas of the map, whereas the mountains around, there are more species up there in the mountains. And so for the next step of this research, what we wanted to do was relate what we know now about the trends of native tree diversity across the state to our current urban forests. And so to do that, we took data from the California Urban Forest Inventory, and we made species lists. So we took the species list, for example, for Sacramento, and we counted the number of species, and then we assessed for each of those species which are native to Sacramento's urban forest. So on this pie chart, this is for the 10 most populous cities that we have inventory data for in California. So on this pie chart, one pie is all of the species that are present in that city. And then the blue portion are those species that are not native to that city. And then the yellow slice of the pie, which you'll notice is very small compared to the blue slices of the pie, are those that are native. So in Sacramento, for example, there are about 300 urban tree species growing, and only 3% of those are native to the city. And that's true not just for these 10 most populous cities. This is a trend we see across the state. And so from there, you might wonder, okay, so that's true of species, but perhaps one species really dominates your urban forest, and maybe that species is native, or maybe it isn't. And so we wanted to look at individual trees. So we took every individual tree in the California Urban Forest Inventory and ranked it as native or not native to the city that it's growing in. And we saw that same trend. So again, the pie is all of the trees. The blue are the non-native, and the yellow are the native. And in Sacramento, for example, there's about 120,000 trees, and 94% of them are not native. 6% are native. And what's important to note here is that these trees, native or non-native, are the trees that are growing in our urban forests and providing benefits to residents. So all of these trees are contributing to someone having a better life with trees on their street, right? And so you might wonder, okay, well, maybe we're missing an opportunity. Maybe there are some native species we could be planting that are just being underutilized, and they'd bring tons of benefits to urban forests. And so we looked at, of that species list for that city, how many of those species are planted and how many are not. So Sacramento, again, 11 native species, right? How many of those 11 are planted in that urban forest? And in Sacramento, the answer to that is 8, and 3 are not. So yellow slices of these pies represent the native species that are planted in that city's current urban forest, and blue represents species that are not currently planted in that urban forest. And on average, California cities have 4 species of native trees that are not currently being utilized. And again, 4 compared to the hundreds, even if you advocate heavily for those 4 species and plant them all over, you're not really going to make a huge difference in the species diversity of your city, right? 4 is a lot less than the hundreds that are present already. And there's no reason to say that those 4 might be great urban trees. They actually could be riparian trees that need a lot of water, you know? So you really need to make your species decisions based not just on native or non-native, but like what's gonna do well. And I'm sure many of you are all aware of this. So we have a huge diversity of trees available in our urban forests beyond what is native. And in fact, we have very few native trees to our urban forests in California. But if you'd like to know what's native to your city, you can go to this QR code, and I'll leave it up for a second if you open it on your phone. It takes a second to load, so you can save it for later. But here you can click on any city in California, and you can see the native tree species list for that city. And if you want to know where within your city a certain species is native, you can click on that little tree icon and turn on and off the city ranges to look at them all spatially. And you can see what proportion of your city is currently native or not. But in doing all of this, you of course want to recognize, you know, what is going to be a good tree for your city, not just native or non-native. And so I'd like to pass it off to Dr. Natalie Luff, who's going to talk about climate suitability of the top 200 trees grown in California's urban forests. Thank you.
All right. Hi, my name is Natalie Love, and I am a postdoc at Cal Poly, and I've been working with this team for the last couple of years. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of our newest projects, which is assessing the suitability of urban tree species in California based on the climate that those trees are native to. And we are really interested and driven to complete this project because of climate change, which is really threatening the trees in our urban environments. And so in order to maintain canopy cover in urban environments and the ecosystem benefits that canopy cover provides to all of the residents of urban areas, we need to think about planting trees that are going to tolerate future climate. And so how do we achieve this? So our team asked whether we could use a really data-driven approach to try and predict which tree species are going to do well as the climate changes. And we also wanted to do this on a location-specific basis. So can we actually make location-specific recommendations for climate-adapted species? So for example, a species that might be suitable for planting in Northern California as the climate changes in the future might not be suitable for places like the desert. So we really wanted to do this analysis across kind of broad-scale climate zones in California. And so those are the 6 climate zones shown on the map that we were interested in assessing species suitability for. So to do this, what we did was we gathered data for about 100 tree species, 100 very commonly grown tree species in California for which we could find really good native range data for. And what we did was we compared the climate that that species experiences and is theoretically adapted to in its native range to the different climate zones in California. And we were interested in understanding where those overlap. How similar are the climates in California, in different parts of California, to the native climate where these species have evolved. And so, like I said, we did this for about just over 100 very common urban tree species, so for which we could find really good native range data for. And this is an example of one of the species that we did this analysis for, which is the Atlas cedar. And the Atlas cedar is a tree that is native to the Atlas Mountains in northern Africa. And up on the top there, that map shows the native range of the species. It's actually fairly spotty and small throughout the mountains. But what we did was we downloaded occurrence data, so actual data points where individual trees are. And we used those occurrence data, we overlaid them with climate data layers so that we could extract information about the types of climate that those individuals experience in their native range. So understanding what kinds of ranges in temperature they experience, what kinds of ranges in precipitation do they experience. And the idea is that that is a pretty good representation of the climatic tolerance of that species. And so then what we can do is compare that to the climate zones in California. And so what we are looking at here is a fairly simple kind of representation of climate space. On the x-axis, down at the bottom there, we have mean annual temperature. And on the y-axis is precipitation. And each one of those 6 climate zones in California are represented on that graph from purple to yellow. So that shows kind of the climate space and the range of climates that occur in each one of those climate zones. And overlaid right on top of that is the climate space in the native range of the Atlas cedar. And so we can see how similar and how well those overlap. And we can use that to assess suitability of that species in the different climate zones in California. And what we can do is also use future predicted climate data to do a very similar analysis. So instead of just saying, okay, where will that species be suitable or where is the climate similar now, we can also look forward based on predictions and say where in California is similar, will be similar to that species' native range as the climate changes in the future. And so here is a map that shows the predicted changes in temperature in California over the next 20 to 40 years. And we can see that all of California is predicted to be much warmer, but the inland portions of the state are predicted to warm faster than coastal portions, especially the LA Basin and Orange County and places like that. And here is the predicted change in precipitation. So some places are predicted to overall get wetter during that period. Some places are predicted to be drier, especially in Southern California. But in general, California is expected to experience more extremes, so more extreme droughts and more extreme floods as well. And so we can use this future predicted climate data to also generate this overlap model and look at how well the future climate in California is predicted to overlap with the native climate in each of these species ranges. And of course, we know that climate is more than just temperature and precipitation. And so what we did for this analysis was we actually used 8 different climate variables, including temperature and precipitation, but as well as some seasonality variables. So when does that rain come, or when in the year is it actually hottest in California? And we used a method called principal component analysis that allowed us to take all of those 8 climate variables and reduce all of that variation down into 3 dimensions. And so that way we could actually construct this kind of 3D climatic niche. And so what you're seeing up there on the graph is basically the climate in each one of the climate zones in California represented as this 3D ellipse, and the climate niche, for example, of the Atlas cedar that's represented in that the red ellipse there. And then what we can do is calculate an overlap. So how much does the climate of the Atlas cedar actually overlap with the climate in each one of the climate zones in California? And we can use that to quantify basically how suitable or how similar is the climate across the different places in California. And so for the Atlas cedar, we can see based on this analysis that the inland valleys and the interior west are relatively well suited, meaning that the climate is relatively similar to the climate of the native range of the Atlas cedar. Northern California and the Southwest desert are moderately suited under current conditions. But we can see that those change as we use future predicted variables. And so the suitability in the inland valleys and the interior west drops, but it actually becomes more suitable in Northern California. And so we can generate maps that look like this, where we can show visually where the Atlas cedar is suited or not suited for in California. And we hope that we can add these maps. Our goal is to add these types of maps to select trees, so that way it can be used as a tool to inform species selection, especially when we're thinking about more resilient urban forests for the future. And we also think that this tool is very useful because it can also tell us where urban forests might be at risk based on the species that are currently planted there. So for example, this is the coast redwood. These are some results from that analysis. And under current conditions, as we might expect, Northern California, where this species occurs natively, is very well suited to planting in the urban forest. The climate is very similar across that climate zone, and it's moderately similar in the inland valleys, especially probably in the northern inland valleys. But if we project that into the future, we see that the inland valleys become low suitability habitat for the coast redwood. And we know from our inventory data that this is actually the 5th most common tree planted in the inland valleys. There's over 61,000 of them in our database right now. So all of those trees are potentially at risk as the climate changes. So this is another way that we think we can use this information, is not only to think about how we can plant more resilient climate resilient urban forests, but also as a way to assess which urban forests are at risk based on these data. Okay, so based on this analysis, what are some species that might be well suited for California's climate as California's future climate? So this is a selection of a few species, and I've added the climate zones that these are relatively suitable for. One of which is Quercus willis-lezeni, the interior live oak, that it came out as suitable for Northern California, the interior West, and the inland valleys, and that's one of our California native species. Also, the blue palo verde, which is native to the deserts in California, is potentially well suited for kind of the drier portions of our state. And then for coastal regions, what came out as relatively well suitable was the monogum, Eucalyptus viminalis, which is a native to Australia and to Tasmania. Okay, so is this a silver bullet approach for the future? Well, not entirely. As we think about any type of criteria for selecting species, there are some things to think about and some things to consider when we are using these data and these results to select species for the future. So first, whether tree physiology traits like drought tolerance or heat tolerance, whether those are very well predicted by the climate is a little bit of an open question. And there's been some research that's shown that the global distribution of a given tree in both its native and planted range is not necessarily a great predictor of these types of traits, how drought and how heat tolerant it is. That's a really good argument for us to kind of restrict our analysis to only looking at the native range, because there is some data that shows that within the native range of populations, climate does actually do a pretty good job of predicting these types of tolerance traits. Second, some species like the sweet gum, liquid amber, those species have very large ranges. So this is the range, the natural range of the liquid amber, and you can see that there's some populations in the south and some populations in the north, and it's likely that the populations in the south have a much higher heat tolerance than populations in the north. This is a phenomenon called local adaptation of that population. And we don't know too much about where the seeds were sourced, which population seeds were sourced from for urban plantings and urban stock, but that could potentially affect how well suited that species is, even given our analyses. Third, there are also microregion considerations. So for example, the Fremont cottonwood came out as relatively well suited for urban environments in California, likely because it grows in relatively warm places, right? It probably has a fairly high heat tolerance, but we know that that species is actually a riparian species and probably needs a decent amount of water. And so the nature of our analysis, because of the nature of our analysis, it really captures kind of broad scale climatic patterns and not as much of microregion patterns like water table availability and groundwater availability and things like that. So it's important to consider, you know, kind of the native habitat of some of these species when thinking about species selection. But these results also highlight the need to look for potentially novel species for your city or for California's urban environment in general. There's a couple approaches to doing this. One is to look at your city and say, okay, what is a city, based on the climate projections, what is a city that currently has a really similar climate to what we are expected to have in the future? And then look at what trees that they are growing in their urban environment and ask people what are doing well in those urban environments, and then think about potentially planting those in your city. And the California Urban Forest Inventory that Jenn talked about earlier could potentially be a tool to facilitate that type of comparison. And another would be to look at places in the world that have climate that is similar to California and is similar to the predicted future climate of California, and look at what they have growing in their urban forests and what species are native to those places as well. And so, for example, Southwest Australia has a climate that's very similar to Southern California, and one of the species that is native to that region and that is grown widely in their urban forest and is a very handsome tree is the salmon gum, Eucalyptus salmonifloia. So again, is this a silver bullet approach for solving the problem of climate resiliency in California's urban forests? Not exactly, but it is a good tool and a good starting place for selecting species that could potentially be suitable as the climate changes in the future and as we're thinking about planning for urban forest resiliency. So I'd like to wrap up by acknowledging some of our collaborators and our data partners and our generous funders, including CAL FIRE. Thank you for making our work fun and wonderful, and thank you for helping us provide these resources to all of you guys here. Thank you for listening.
I'm just going to say one more thing before we get to I'm going to provide just a little teaser for a project that we're currently working on, which is we have been tasked with creating an urban forest assessment tool for cities to figure out how is my city doing in terms of urban forest management and what could I do better to take my urban forestry program sort of to the next level. And so this is, I hope that the Relief Network will be a key partner in us building this tool. It's in its sort of draft phase right now. We just came from the WCISA meeting in Tahoe, where we presented this tool to urban foresters from cities, to nonprofits, and also to the private sector urban forestry community, where we sort of said, what data do you need to make the case to granting agencies or to your city council to advocate for your urban forest? And so that's something we're sort of like in a listening session phase right now. So if you have ideas of metrics, given the data that you know that we have, if there are certain metrics for your city that you said, like, what I want to do is just go online and be able to pull up a report that says blank, please email us and let us know, and we'll try to build that into our tool. So with that, I think we'll take questions at this point.
Yeah, so I wasn't joking when I said deep dive, right? We got a lot, so we just heard 4 different presentations and a lot of information, so try to remember back to all of them, but yeah, we'll walk around the microphones and have some good dialogue.
Oh, yes, it is. Well, this is one of the reasons why we started with the list of species that we started with is a list of species that are commonly grown in California. And so these are species that are already fairly common in our urban forests. There was 2 reasons we started with this. One is that those are species that are likely going to be in the nursery trade and available for planting. We just hope that this information can kind of target those planting to where those trees are most climatically suitable. And 2, we've been growing them in our urban forests for decades, and we have a good idea of how, whether or not they might be weedy or a concern for being weedy, or whether or not, they're easy to grow and easy to prune and things like that. And so the Atlas cedar, it probably provides fairly good habitat for birds and things like that, and is not necessarily weedy. So some of those kind of weedy concerns, because we know more about that species, are not as much of a concern. So that's why we really started with the top 200 most common species in California.
Was that your question? Yeah, I mean, I think that really speaks to right tree, right place, right? Every
every different planting is going to have a different set of priorities that need to be considered. So on select tree for each tree species, we talk about its habitat suitability for things like insects and birds and other wildlife. So that's a search criteria, but it's really going to depend on your place and what you're going for.
Is my microphone on? Can you guys hear me? Another thing I would say to add to what Jenn is saying there is we also don't know very much. We don't know very much about the suitability of different species associated with different animals, because those are hard studies to do, and we have a sample size of one in the sense that those things have disappeared. We're bringing them back. We know with birds that species is less important than diversity in canopy and diversity in leaf size. But if you want to talk about insects, we know less than we'd like to about that. But I will also remind everybody a thing that you all know, which is over 95% of California's population lives on about, 4.5% of the land area. And the function of the urban forest, as we see it, as we move forward in this research, with that 4.5% of the land area and the urban forest there, is to improve the quality of life of the humans that are living there first and foremost. People need shade, and many communities don't have as much as they need, and so that's the priority. So what urban forest tree is the best? The one that works, the one that creates a tree, and that's a difficult thing in many situations, because if you think of what we demand of these trees, it's shocking that any of them are there after 20 or 30 years. It's a very brutal environment. And so we are looking for, in the kind of modeling that Natalie just presented, trees that thrive on neglect, that have evolved in very harsh areas, harsher than California's urban areas. Well, is there any place harsher than California's urban areas? Maybe not. But be that as it may, we're looking for those species that do the best. And then down on the priority list, I think after improving the quality of people's lives that need that shade and need that urban forest, are things like what you're talking about. Can we have wildlife corridors that come through our cities? It is a small land area, but it's important for wildlife. And so that we're treating that as a secondary priority, but it's an important one. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. That presentation was fabulous. My question is about the native trees, and the pushback that tends to happen on a local level is, well, if they can't be native, we don't want any trees, and or they have to be very regionally specific in terms of native trees. So do you have any suggestions or support with that potential argument?
Can I answer it, and then I'll let you expand on it? You sure? Okay, I would say, Nancy, that's a great question, and we do get that pushback, but I think that we have nothing to do but to educate people, right? That's where our goal is here, and one of those things is to say to people, well, here's your palette. This is what it is, and if you want really regionally specific native things, you have reduced the possible palette that you have for diversity. We know that diversity in urban forests, this has been published many, many times, diversity equals resilience. And so yes, you can make that argument, but the diversity is heavily reduced if you go for native only based on the work that Camille has done. You guys saw that presentation. There isn't a lot. Why is that? Well, because California has a Mediterranean climate, and many of the places where our cities currently were at one time rolling hills of coastal scrub and chaparral, where there weren't trees. And in many parts of California, Sacramento included, there are more trees here now than there were before human incursions into California. Go back 13,000, 15,000, 20,000 years, there are more trees in parts of California now than there were before that, since the Miocene, when it was much hotter and warmer here. So you want to expand on that?
I think that was great.
Okay.
I would just say as well that it's very tricky, because one role that the urban forest plays globally, and this is true for all horticulture, is biodiversity conservation. So there are trees that we're growing in our urban forests that are rare and endangered in their native habitat, and we actually prevent the extinction of those species by growing them in the urban forest. This is true for some California native trees like the Monterey cypress, but it's also true for things like the red flowering gum, which is native and endangered in Australia.
And so, you know, if you think about biodiversity and the extinction crisis on our planet, the urban forest plays a role in conservation as well. And I'm a Californian, and I love the California flora. And so if you think about, well, yeah, what defines places and makes places special, our native flora is certainly a part of that. However, I forgot what I was going to say, actually.
I think you're nailing it. You're saying that you love the California flora, and I'll.
What would I normally say here?
Yeah, exactly. I'll caveat my answer by saying that also I'm on the statewide board of the California Native Plant Society, and I love native plants, and I think that conservation of wild areas in California is one of the most important things that nonprofit and government agencies are doing right now. Conservation of wild areas is really important, but that is in many ways outside the discussion of what we do with this 3.5% of the land area where all the people live and where their lives need to be improved. They can coincide somewhat, but they have conservation of wild areas and augmentation of the urban forest with a diversity of species is, and we have a lucky aspect in California. I'll say this because it doesn't rain for 8 months. Tree weeds in California are very rare. We don't have very many of them. Our weeds in California are grasses and members of the Asteraceae for the most part. Those are the problematic sunflowers. Those are the weedy things. Sure, we have some tree weeds, but not like other places in the world. So we can experiment with things that work in the urban forest, and they don't escape to our wildlands like they do in other places. So that's not a huge threat. Our threat is just ourselves and the people. The people are the hardest parts to manage in the urban forest. Yeah. And so. I
also just remembered what I was going to say.
Oh, okay, nice. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So here's the other problem with planting natives, and particularly the trend is to advocate for only locally sourced seeds from a watershed. But that is theoretically in evolutionary biology is an open question. Will things from that watershed do well in that watershed in the future climate? We do not know the answer to that. It's the same as Natalie's analysis. For some species, we do know that, and people say no, the locally sourced genetics will not do well. And then humans are faced with a conundrum. What do? Let's bring in genotypes from the south to try to create more drought adaptation in this population of trees. And so it really, it's an interesting and trendy idea that has caught on that is not backed by a lot of science. Because if we care about the native trees of California, we have to do the exact same analysis that Natalie presented for our urban trees, like where are California native trees going to do well? And then what's the human obligation or response to helping get those seeds across the LA basin or get them over the mountain or up in elevation. And so everything is changing. Everything has always been changing. And anyway, so same problem.
Let's allow for some more questions. Right.
How is the California Urban Forest Inventory updated? I know that you mentioned that organizations are sharing data, but are they following up when trees die or they're removed? And then a second part to that is how can organizations share their data with you?
Oh, yeah, Camille.
The inventory is updated about once a year. We get a new kind of input from one of our largest data providers, which is West Coast Arborists, and then kind of haphazardly among the other databases. So whenever a city does a new inventory, we get that data and we hope to include it in our inventory. And you should email us, and we would love to take your data. And then let me know if you need our information, and we will get that to you. It's not up on the screen right there, but yes, the more data, the better, and we will take that and ingest it and put it right up on the portal.
We've got a question back here.
I had a personal experience up Newcastle, north of Roseville a little bit, wanted to put in a new tree in my yard, and being part of the Urban Forest Foundation, talked to our board tree expert, and she's gone down to Davis, UC Davis, and talked down there. So there's a Canby oak that she suggested that I look for, and so I loved it. I looked it up, and I could not find one to get to put in my yard. And so, and apparently that might be a recommended species that's moving north. It's more climate adaptive. And so I didn't get one to plant, but I would still like to maybe sometime. So the nurseries, and I went to every nursery that I could drive to within a reasonable distance, and also called, and they had never heard of it, and so that wasn't part of their, you know, they weren't going to be buying it, but they were going to look into it. And so, you know, how is that word getting out to the nurseries so that the public then can start doing smarter decision making and buying the right kind of tree for our environment?
Yeah, so you can't plant a tree that you can't buy, right? And Quercus cambii is a great species. In fact, it's from West Texas and northern Mexico, and it looks like many parts of California are going to become West Texas and northern Mexico, and it's well adapted for there. We have gone through the process with Dave Muffley and other people of collecting acorns out of the native range and moving them into the nursery trade, and it just takes time. That takes time. And one thing we're doing with Select Tree, a big change that's coming very soon, is that you'll be able to go on there, you'll be able to log in and then keep your own list. This is my organization's planting list. We make it public or we don't make it public. And also, what will also be able to happen is we're a nursery. Here's the list of trees that we have available, and this is searchable by anybody who wants it. So you go on Select Tree, you put in Quercus cambii, and say who has it available. Then you get the contact information of the person who has the tree in a 15-gallon size container for you. So we are really trying to connect people around trees because there has to be a nursery connection in any improvement in the urban forest. If we don't, it's fine and dandy if you go onto our service and you find the perfect tree there. And this happens all the time. You find the perfect tree and then you go to Home Depot and you buy what's on sale. And you plant that, right? That happens. It happens all the time. But what we need is to push the nurseries. And you all should know the nursery trade is brutal. It's brutal. They have a lot of overhead. They don't grow things that they can't sell. And they won't risk. Well, how do we get them? How do we bring them along? If we're going to improve and change the urban forest and make it more resilient in the future, we have to, first of all, we have to connect them with demand. And so I think we can do that through Select Tree, in that it is the most highly used tree website, one of the most highly used tree websites in the world, and the most highly used one in California. So we can connect people to that. It's a big marketing thing, basically, where who wants these trees and are you growing them? So we can alleviate the conservativeness of the nursery trade a little bit that way. So we're working on it. We're trying. And you want to add something to that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so one feature to that site is that it allows smaller and local nurseries to connect with a wide audience of people who need trees. So basically anybody who wants to sell their tree can just put whatever their inventory is on Select Tree. And the other tool is that people can say, I want this tree, and then the nurseries can receive that information of like, look, there is demand for that species. You're not currently growing it, but look, 400 people said they wanted this tree. So it's a two-way street.
And I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, great. I'm from Sacramento, and when you had the slide about the most popular trees in Sacramento, I didn't understand what trees was the most popular.
The London plane tree.
It was in scientific language.
Yeah, the London plane. Sorry about that. That's the London plane tree, the sycamore.
Okay, the sycamore.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
Great. And so then I went on to the Select Tree to select a tree, and I wanted a round shaded tree, a native tree, but when it came to the leaves, it asked me if I wanted here it is right here, a trifoliate, a palmately compound, pinnately compound, or bipinnately compound.
Yeah, don't worry about yeah.
I chose one of those selections, and I didn't get a tree at all.
Yeah.
And then my neighbor here, she chose pinnately or pinnately, I don't even know if I'm saying it right, but she got 15 trees. So when we take these tools to the community, it may be easier for us to use them with the community, maybe if they're just simple, a little more simpler, and are they in any other languages than English?
Yes. Yeah, so we're making it as least technical as possible, but we have a bunch of constituents, and so you can go on there, and I recommend for the first time people use Select Tree, don't select more than one, maybe two characters that you want. Make it Yeah, right. Because what you're doing is you're very quickly reducing the possibilities. And so select one thing, select evergreen at a certain height, for instance, or deciduous at a certain height, or a planting area if you want. Do that kind of thing, and do one, and then you can look through pictures and you can see that. Because what you do, basically, is true of any database. If you choose 4 things that are mutually exclusive, you're going to eventually go down to 0 very quickly in that. So I won't make too many apologies for Selectree because we have a large constituent of people that use it, and everything non-technical everything technical there that's botanical, we've tried to get rid of everything possible that we could, so to make it usable for people who aren't us, who are not like the tree nerds that want to know every word and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
The chart as common names is a great suggestion. That's an easy thing to fix.
Yeah.
So.
Appreciate that. And with that, because we know we're a little bit over time, I'll say thank you all for participating with us, in the sense that what we do is publicly available. What we do is living things that we want feedback and help. And the Urban Forest Assessment Tool is going to become very important. So we hope that you guys continue to partner with us and communicate with us and send us emails. We love that stuff. So thank you all for listening, and I appreciate being here.
Let's give them another round of applause. The Cal Poly team.
Can I point out one more thing? I want to just point out one more thing, because I brought in a magical box of wood right over here, and I know you guys are going to have an afternoon break. We actually have to, Jen and I teach a class tomorrow. We have to leave to go back to San Luis Obispo, so we're going to leave you. But I'm going to leave this box with Cindy. This is a 100-year-old collection of wood, and I know there's urban wood people